I find myself asking my children this question over and over again. Maybe you can relate, or maybe I'm just the only one. I'm pretty sure I've learned it from other people's behavior. I would think that that's probably right. Maybe, like I said, maybe you asked the question. I asked the question to Emerson and to Hadley. What do you want to be when you grow up? I asked them that question, and it changes. From time to time, there's just this whole new thing that happens, right? Right now, Emerson he's like stuck on being a policeman, which is my brother-in-law, Uncle Nick. His Uncle Nick is a policeman, and Uncle Nick is the cool kind of policeman. He gets all kind of special gear and really big things that he hides in the trunk. Just really cool stuff. And so when he gets to see him in that gear, it's like, man, that's what I want to do, you know? The other thing he wants to be is he wants to be a paleontologist. And I'm not sure, that's a pretty large spectrum. I'm not sure how that happens, but that's kind of what he's thinking. And it can change. Who knows what it will change to? I asked Hadley the same questions, and she changes her answers from time to time. But I wonder maybe if we're asking the wrong question. I wonder if it's easier for us to ask the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? But I wonder if it's the wrong question. Maybe there's a better question we can begin with. I say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or is it who do you want to be when you grow up? Maybe that's a better question. Because I think ultimately, no matter what you are, who you are determines just how good at what you do you are. Boy, that should be like a Dr. Seuss thing. Hold on. I can't even say it again. I just made it up right there. I have no idea what I just said. But I'm pretty sure it was right. I mean, we'll check the tape. I'm pretty sure it was right. I think that's got to be the question. Who do you want to be when you grow up? You might think, well, Clint, do you think you're in children's church? It's down the hall. You're right. It is down the hall. But I think that question is still valid for each one of us. I think there's never a point in time that we stop growing up. Maybe we come to the place where we decided we no longer wish to grow up, or maybe we come to a place where we've decided we no longer wish to think that we can grow up, but that doesn't change the fact that we grow up. We might grow up in our anger or our discontent or our intolerance. We might grow up in a skill set. We might grow up in our love for our family and our community. We might grow up in our skepticism. We might grow up in our doubt. We might grow up in our faith. Growing up never stops. The question becomes, who do you want to be when you grow up? There's an answer, I believe, that we can find in the Bible. It's a guide for us in this growth, this growing up season of life that never seems or never will end. I think the answer is to be like Jesus. Now, maybe that's the church answer, right? Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be like Jesus. Yeah, I think that's the church answer. I think that's what I have to say when I stand up here and we preach on Sunday mornings, right? But maybe, just maybe, there's a case that the church answer actually is the right answer. And I hope that I can make that for you today. I hope that when you walk away here in just a few moments, that you've come to a place where you recognize maybe there is value in growing up to be like Jesus. There's a word for it that we find in the Bible. It's one of our values. We're finishing up a 4-week series on our values where we've walked through the 4 main components that kind of make us who we are as a church. And we're concluding today with the foundational value that everything else is built upon. And it's this concept of who do you want to be when you grow up? The word for it we find here is discipleship. It's a big word, I get it. It's not one that you typically walk around in your everyday walking around life, just throwing out here and there in your normal conversations. It doesn't mean that the word is less valuable or that it's archaic or that it's something that shouldn't be used. It describes something that's incredibly important to who we are. You're a disciple of someone or something. It doesn't just have to be Jesus. When we characterize or define discipleship in terms of the church, we would characterize it this way. Discipleship is following Jesus with the intent of becoming like him. When I think of discipleship, that's what I'm trying to throw your way. That we're following Jesus with the intent of becoming like him. We're not following Jesus because it's fun to watch him do his thing. We're not following Jesus because, hey, life just kind of feels better when we're connected to something. But real discipleship, which you can do those things. People do them all the time. But if you want to be in the discipleship relationship, if you want to be involved in this discipleship thing, there has to be intent behind it. And that intent has to say, you know what, the reason I'm doing this is to become like the guy that I'm following. And so when that disconnect is there, when you're here for a different reason, it is what it is. It is what it is. And it's okay for you to come to church and explore and discover and take a time to experience and figure out what do you want to do. But at some point, you do have to make that decision. I do want to be a disciple of Jesus if you want to be connected to him. You have to say, I do want to be like him. We see that in baptism. That's that first step that says, I want to be like him. Jesus was baptized. We see throughout the Bible the significance of it. That we're buried in death. That we take part in his death, his burial, and we're raised to life just as in resurrection. Peter famously says in Acts 2:38, when they cry out, the crowd cries out, so what should we do if we believe in Jesus? He says, repent and be baptized, every one of you. Start this process of becoming like Jesus. We break discipleship down into 4 different areas. I don't expect you to remember these. We're not even going to put them on the screen. I'm just going to hit them very briefly. The first one is that worship. We talk about Sundays and every other day. That worship is both of those things. That, yeah, we come here and we do this thing as one. We put words on the screen, so if you don't know them, we can still do it together. But hopefully when we leave this place, the worship continues. And we still continue to operate as one when we go into our community. We see in the Bible that the Bible actually gives us a precedent for our work and what we do with our everyday lives being considered worship. That the way we treat our families is considered worship. That ultimately every single thing that we take part of or part in our life can be filed under this heading of worship. So Sundays and other days, that's part of becoming like Jesus. We want to study like Jesus. We want to worship like Jesus. We want to study like Jesus. And when we talk about study, we're talking about we want to study together as a group of believers, which is what we're doing now, but we also want to study alone. That on a daily basis, we're asking that question like Robin did a couple of weeks ago. Do you meditate on the Word of God day and night when you rise and when you go to sleep? The encouragement out of the book of Deuteronomy was that you would wake your kids with the Word of God and you would put them to sleep with the Word, concentrating on what God was doing. That same thing applies to each one of us. Are we doing it together and are we doing it alone? We want to serve like Jesus, want to worship like Jesus, study like Jesus, want to serve like Jesus. I think the best definition I've been able to come up with serving is this. Serving means that your life is routinely inconvenienced for the good of others. I think that is difficult. I think that is difficult for us to come to because inconvenience, the way that we put our schedules together, the way that we order our lives, anything that kind of jumps in there and separates it, immediately we have this reaction like, no, I already had my week planned, my days planned, whatever planned. But I don't think until inconvenience steps into what's happening with you, I'm not quite sure you've really gotten into serving yet. We obviously see that Jesus served. We want to worship like Jesus, study like Jesus, serve like Jesus, and finally, we want to share like Jesus. We want to be confident in the story that God has written inside of us. Each of you has a story. Some of you are still in the early chapters of your story. You haven't even gotten to the chapter where you recognize that you are rescued. And for some of you, that rescue chapter could still be a long ways off because you haven't decided to read it or write it yet. But God writes this story in your life. And ultimately, what he wants us to do when we talk about becoming like Jesus is to have the confidence to share that story. Because no one is an expert about what God has done for you more than you. Now, you might say, it's difficult. If you're a follower of Jesus, you might say, I don't know what to say. I'm not sure how to engage in faith-based conversation. I think it's okay. Just tell your story. Have confidence in what God has done in your life and share that. Let that be a starting point, a place to begin. We want to worship like Jesus, study like Jesus, serve like Jesus, and we want to share like Jesus. Ultimately, that's what we're pursuing in discipleship. That's what we're chasing after as we say, we want to have an intention to become like the person we're following. The discipleship is following Jesus with the intent of becoming like him. That in those 4 areas, that's what we're chasing down. So if we understand kind of what discipleship is, that we can break it down into those 4 areas, the question is not what it is, because I think most people kind of find it, okay, gotcha, we want to live like Jesus. Okay, fine. You can put 4 headings on it, but really that's the big heading. Be like Jesus. Following in that relationship. Let's be like Jesus. Let's be disciples of Jesus. I don't think I have to sell anybody on what discipleship is. I think this is what we have to sell people on if there's something to sell at all, is why is it valuable? When we talk about values and the things that we covet the most in our lives to make sure that we hold on tightly to in terms of our church, why is discipleship so valuable? Why is becoming like Jesus so valuable? That's a good question. The first reason is because Jesus valued discipleship. That doesn't mean anything to you if you don't believe Jesus is who he says he is. And I can't get into a great picture now to prove to you why I believe Jesus is who he says he is. But on that premise that Jesus is the Son of God, if he is who he says he is, and he values it, that should lead us to the conclusion it should be valued by us. Over and over again, Jesus, throughout his life, would look at other people sitting on the ground, laying on a mat, sitting behind a tax collector's booth, sitting in a boat, just coming in with some fish, hanging out on the beach, sitting in the square, sitting in the market. He would look at them, he would have conversations with them, and then he would end it with, "Come, follow me." Now, he didn't end the sentence with, "Come, follow me so you'll be like me," but they knew it. They knew that that's why they were following him. They knew they were about to be discipled. They knew they were on this journey and they were about to make him his posse, right? They were collecting this entourage that they would walk through the streets with. The invitation to follow me was given when Jesus was here on earth. It hasn't stopped being given. It's still given every single day to each one of us. Will you come, follow me? Today is Sunday. Will you come, follow me? Tuesday morning, you will wake up and Jesus will be sitting in his throne room saying to you, "Come follow me today." Every day he renews his promise to you. Every day he extends the invitation again. Even if you said no yesterday and the day before and for the last 10,000 days, tomorrow morning he'll still give you the same invitation. Come follow me. He never gets tired of hearing you say no or brushing him off. He's persistent. He's consistent. He's going to stay there. He'll continue knocking on your door. He's still waiting for you to make the decision to follow him. Discipleship is the process by which wandering lives find purpose and meaning. Have you ever sat there late at night and asked yourself, what have I made of my life? What have I become? Did I really, when I was sitting there and people asked me when I was 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years old, "Hey, what are you going to be when you grow up?" And I answered them, and I'm nothing like what those answers were. Does it bother you sometimes? Does it keep you up late at night? Do you get disappointed with it? I say there's a solution, there's a remedy to it, because purpose is found in following Jesus. It might not be a purpose that you set out to accomplish when you were 5 and 6, but God can give you new purpose within the confines of what he wants for your life, because he made you, created you, put you in motion, made you the person that you are today. He's been watching over your story watching you author page by page, day in and day out, knowing what your purpose was, and just waiting for you to accept the invitation. I just finished Chip Gaines. I don't know if y'all are a fan of Chip and Joanna Gaines. Yay, yay. How about that? No cheers for Jesus, but cheers for Chip and Joanna. Okay, all right. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I don't know. You tell me. I don't know. Chip Gaines wrote a book called Capital Gains, and I just finished it this past week. It was good. It was a good little get up. He's got some good stories in it. Fellows, if you're like, man, what should I read next? I'd encourage you to pick it up and read it. It's a pretty good little book. He's got a great little story of being in a Mexican desert with a lasso and a bull trying to kill him, and his radiator was busted. It was a pretty good story. It ends fine. I'll spoil it for you, but it's pretty fun getting there. He kind of wraps up his book where he kind of writes his own obituary. And he kind of writes two different obituaries. The first one, he says, hey, here's the deal. I just want to read you my obituary. This is how it honestly could turn out. And he starts reading it, and it talks about how he divorced his wife, and because he was gambling, he lost it all in the World Series of Poker in Vegas and didn't tell Joanna that he bet Magnolia on it, like all of Magnolia. And so he lost all of Magnolia, the Magnolia table, Magnolia Farms, everything Magnolia you can think of, all the trees, they're gone because Chip lost them in Vegas. And so he loses them all, and then his kids don't like him anymore, and he doesn't like himself, and he used to be really good at baseball, but his arm hurts now, all these things. So he reads this. It's a long obituary. Like, I don't know who gets that much space in the paper. Evidently, Chip Gaines does. But this huge obituary, and it's just terrible. But as you're listening to it, you're like, you know what? This could actually happen. Like, it's kind of funny, but at the end of the day, like, this is real. I've heard real people in real lives do these things. And then he follows that up with, but this is what I want my obituary to read like. And he writes it. And some of the stuff we already know, right? That he's an entrepreneur, that he has a bunch of kids, that he has this farm. He restored it from this 1800s farmhouse. And he has a wife, and they've been married 50-something years is what it says in his obituary. And they're happily married, and all these really cool stories. And I love how he ends it. He says, at the end of the day, I get to decide which one of these gets printed. Are you wondering? Are you wondering which one gets printed for you? I'll say it again. Discipleship is the process by which wandering lives find purpose and meaning. You see, the truth is that even if you're halfway through the bad obituary, there's still time to turn it around. Even if you did lose everything you had in Vegas, you put it all on red, and that little ball dropped on black. And you lost it all and everyone hates you. It's still doable to turn things around. Discipleship has the power to do that. That when you begin to follow Jesus with the intent of becoming like him, it can restore purpose. I'd say that's reason one why we value discipleship, because Jesus did. Jesus understood just how valuable it was because of what it could accomplish in broken people's lives. The second reason that we value discipleship is because Jesus asked us to value discipleship. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through 20, he said this, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.'" One of the last things Jesus said to us before he left and went back to heaven to prepare this place for us, he specifically said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go and make disciples. And you're going about, as you go about your life, I want you to focus on this thing, this making disciples. And then he made it even easier. He gave us the ingredients for making disciples. Make disciples, baptizing them, here we go, baptizing them, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And so ultimately, making disciples comes down to baptism and obedience. Ultimately, baptism comes down to obedience. But it goes beyond following directions. It's much beyond that. In fact, in the book of John, chapter 8, he says this, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I want to read that to you again because I'm about to make a point, and I think we need to make sure we have this verse well in hand. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We go back to the ingredients of making a disciple. We say baptism and obeying everything, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So ultimately, even baptism is about obedience because Jesus said, hey, here it is. I'm modeling it for you. Here it comes. Peter says it. It's coming from, here it is. So ultimately, it comes down to obedience. Yet in this obedience, in verse 32, he says, then if you actually do what I ask you to do, if you are obedient, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You see, for us, obedience is about slavery, isn't it? Obedience is about submission. Obedience is about yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Obedience is about following through on the specific things that's been given to us and directives that have been given to us in our lives. But ultimately, here's the thing. With God, obedience will always be about freedom. That's the difference. With God, obedience will always be about freedom. Because then you'll know the truth. And that truth will set you free, he says. Did you notice that when we look at Jesus getting ready to ascend, that this call to make disciples comes before the birth of the church? That Jesus specifically said, go and be disciple makers before he said, go and build buildings or go and collectively gather together on Sunday mornings on the first day of the week. That Jesus, when he said, you know what, if I could tell them one thing, what would it be? Remember, Jesus is incredibly intentional about his words. He doesn't waste words. And so when he made this decision, hey, what can I tell them this last thing? Oh, I should tell them to build healthy churches. Here it is. Go and make healthy churches everywhere. Put them on every block. He didn't say that, though, because he knew that healthy churches wouldn't produce disciples, but disciples would ultimately produce healthy churches. He had to become foundational in what happened. He said, I got to make sure I don't put the cart before the horse. I need the people that love me the most to understand what's most important. Because the making disciples thing becomes a litmus test for whether a church is worth anything or not. And when I say a church is worth anything, I mean us. We have to ask ourselves that question. Ultimately, healthy churches are created as a result of discipleship. That's the truth. But here's the second thing. Healthy churches remain healthy churches as a result of discipleship. If we can't engage as a church to allow people, because it's one of our values, and because it's something Jesus highly values, if we can't give opportunities for you to intentionally follow Jesus with the intent of becoming more like him, if we can't come alongside of you in that process, if you can't come alongside of me in my process, if we can't do that together, then ultimately our church will just be a place to get together and hang out on Sundays. I don't know about y'all, I don't need another place to hang out on Sundays. But there is intent behind what we do and why we do it. And it's to give you an opportunity to accept the invitation and say yes. They say, yeah, maybe I don't know all the 4 things about the worship, study, serve, share. Maybe I don't get all those things yet. I don't have them memorized, and I don't even remember, and I'm a long ways away from studying alone. I can study a little bit here, and I might sign up for a group this afternoon. And maybe that's where you're at. Remember, The intent is to become like Jesus. Discipleship is not, I'm going to follow him because I'm already like Jesus. And there's a large difference between the two. Following Jesus is a process, and it takes time. There's never a moment where you arrive. There's never a moment when you turn a special age, like 65, and all of a sudden you can collect Social Security, also known as discipleship money. Like, it doesn't happen. Like, that doesn't exist. Discipleship never stops. Ultimately, this is one of my favorites. I guess the last reason we should value discipleship is because disciples of Jesus make the world a better place. And that's the truth. Our world is better because of people who follow Jesus. In the book of John, chapter 13, 34 and 35, it says this, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you," this is Jesus talking, "so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So people who honestly follow Jesus, who legitimately are following with the intent to be like him, they come to this place and they recognize that the reason that the world will know who we are and what we do will be by the way that we treat other people. And inherently, the world becomes a better place because we take our roles as disciples, as followers of Jesus seriously. Could it just be that simple, just to love one another? Were John, Paul, George, and Ringo on to something in the 1967 single on the Magical Mystery Tour album? All we need is love? Simply yes. Easy, no. Following Jesus with the intent to become like him is difficult. Ultimately, you might ask the question, so what's the next step? This next step applies to anyone, whether you've been a follower of Jesus for 50 years or you're still minus 50 days before you make your first decision to follow him. This next sentence applies to every single person in the room. You must be challenged. You must be challenged. When we talk about what does it mean to have faith, when we talk about what does it mean to follow Jesus, we ought to be challenged. In fact, we ought to be in a place where it stretches us a bit. When we stretch, we make tiny tears in our muscles, and those muscles, once they've gone a little bit, they heal, but next time you can go a little bit further. And stretching hurts because those tiny tears, to make progress, it just hurts, right? We're actually tearing something. We have to be challenged. You'll know it's a challenge when someone says, hey, maybe try this, or what do you think about doing this, or would you be willing to do this? And you immediately say, nope, not going to happen. There's your red flag that you've been challenged. Because again, stretching hurts. Let me ask you a question. Who do you want to be 5 years from now? Who do you want to be? If you're thinking to yourself and you thought of anything other than, I'd like to be more like Jesus, you might have set the bar a little low. If you said, I'd like to have my master's degree 5 years from now. You said, I'd like to own my own business 5 years from now. I'd like to, whatever it is, 5 years from now. All of those are incredible goals. But if you could be more like Jesus 5 years from now, just think about the what you do and just how much better it would be. Because the who you are makes the what you do that much better. If you begin with the goal in mind, it will keep you from wandering aimlessly after lesser versions of yourself. And ultimately, when we're not in a relationship and pursuing that with Jesus, we're just settling for less. We're settling for what only our minds can imagine. And our imagination is limited, as grand as it may be sometimes. Simply follow Jesus. Simply follow Jesus.